Oh no, guys! Nintendo has a job listing that has the letters DEI in it. I suppose Nintendo has gone woke. I suppose they're bad now. I suppose Pokemon is doomed and that Nintendo won't be good anymore. They never were good, but now we can safely say for certain that Nintendo is ruined. Why are people like this? Because that's been the trend ever since I noticed like Gamergate 2 taking off, is that like everybody really desperately wants to pretend that Nintendo is like all in on the DEI stuff, like they're all in on woke stuff, but like the reality is that's not the case at all, right? Like it is pretty obvious like any issues that Nintendo has with like localization and woke culture entirely comes from like a Nintendo of America. And that's entirely because like they're based in like the wokest areas in the country, you know, Seattle, California, and Austin, Texas, right? Like there is no getting around this fact, right? That like there's not really much wokeness in Nintendo games at all, right? You know, I've confirmed recently that like the pronoun issues in regards to characters like Juniper and Act were like forced by the localization, don't make any sense at all. And we're not present in the original Japanese. So it's like the idea that Nintendo is woke at like the source is like absurd and like just not true at all. Right now, of course, we have like an issue with localization companies, but that's a completely different issue, right? So again, why exactly are people like this? Like desperately trying to convince you that Nintendo is like going to the dark side all the time. And especially since like it's really obvious that the people who are pushing for this stuff like aren't actually fans. That's the thing that really gets me about this is that like people are complaining about stuff that's perfectly normal for Japanese products now. Like it's really noticeable. Like I saw somebody in like the Yellow Flash post complain about Grusha from Pokemon Scarlet and Violet, like, oh, he looks like a girl. That's woke. No, it's not. Like that's perfectly normal. Like there's nothing weird about that, especially in like Japanese culture. Like again, like this is kind of the issue with a lot of like woke discourse is that like people look at like perfectly normal things that like Nintendo does and like see it as like woke, right? You know, like I do think a good example of that is um let's see the Mario movie, right? You know, they had Princess Peach play a proactive role, right? She wasn't kidnapped the entire time. But you had a lot of these people try to come out and say, like, oh, she's woke. The movie's woke. The Nintendo Cinematic Universe is over before it ever began. And, like, the movie was great. Peach was great. You know, I think it really popularized the character, right? And, like, in general, there was nothing really wrong with the movie. But you still see people pretend it was woke. And you still see people pretend that, like, uh, the movies are going to get worse, right? You know, I saw Sean Malmstrom do that. Uh, you also have like you know stuff like Xenoblade Chronicles 3, right? That's a weird narrative that I keep seeing people point out is that like, oh, Xenoblade Chronicles 3 is less sexy than 2. That proves that Nintendo of America censored the game for Western audiences, which is really dumb considering like the ending, like confirming that Rex like banged all three of his waifus and had like children with all of them. Like that is like the most anti-woke thing in existence. Okay, let's be real here. Like the themes and the ideas of like Xenoblade Chronicles 3 are so anti-woke, like they're so ingrained in that culture that like the idea that they like censored anything is like laughable to me. Like the reason that characters are less sexualized in Xenoblade Chronicles 3 has everything to do with the fact that these people do not know what sex is, right? These are clones bred for war who don't really like distinguish between male and female and don't really know like they don't know how babies are made, right? Like this isn't me being like speculative. Like this is legit a part of the plot, right? There's a reason that the characters aren't overly sexualized, right? Like this is a really good example of what I'm talking about here. Is that the developers made a creative decision where they were just like, okay, we're just gonna make this kind of game, right? It's gonna be darker, it's gonna be like more realistic, it's gonna be a mishmash of like elements from 1 and 2, right? We're gonna tone down the sexiness because that suits the tone. Right? It's like how like Fist of the North Star isn't like a sexualized anime, right? Does that mean it was censored? No, but it just wasn't the focus of that series, right? Kind of like how Dragon Ball went from like being a comedy to being like a serious action show, right? Was it censored? No, that was just the natural progression, the way the story developed, right? Like it's a perfectly ordinary part of the public, like the process, right? But every single time this kind of thing happens, like you have these people screaming at the top of their lungs, like woke, 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 and it's just like no, like none of this stuff is woke. And the fact that they have to reach like so far to try to justify like being angry at Nintendo, like complaining about Fire Emblem localizations, for example, right? That's their go-to thing to complain about these days, and it's such a laughable, out of touch thing to do because there's nothing wrong with the localizations. Like the fact that like they still have to bring up like one support chain and like Fire Emblem Fates says a lot, I think. Right? The fact that like they don't really discuss like issues with like Engage or Three Houses at all, like says it all, I believe. To me, like Fire Emblem is an example of how Nintendo does a really good job localizing products. And I just the complaining that people have about it is just so off base it becomes like kind of laughable, right? Like it is impossible to take seriously. And like I would like to remind people that like we're just off fresh off a controversy with Discotech, right? Where like the contractor Jello Apocalypse like admitted in a blog post that he like censored a ton of content in that anime, right? He wanted to remove a lot more stuff. He thought it was terrible. We made it good, right? Like, he was talking about all the drastic changes he wanted to do, and the localization company refused, and like, there was a big kerfuffle about that. Like, you'll notice that these people aren't talking about that at all. And yet they're hyper focusing on Nintendo, who hasn't done anything. Like again, I think the Jello Apocalypse thing like kind of proves a couple of things about this kind of thing, right? First of all, that it's primarily like, egotistical people doing it. And secondly, like it's not necessarily real employees. It's like contractors, right? People who are brought on for the one project and then are like let go to work on other projects, right? Like he was brought on for that anime and then left that anime and then like complained about his time there, right? Like that to me I think speaks volumes about how this actually works, right? Like you have people who have like who are e-celebs who like have a lot more like freedom to express themselves, who are like willing to criticize people in the industry and like make up some really wild, bold claims. Like they have a lot more like liberty to do stuff like that and get away with it, right? So like to me, like complaining organizations like Treehouse, like specifically, doesn't seem to be productive to me. Like to me, like like a lot of times people don't even know like who's localizing what, right? Like sometimes Treehouse outsources their localizations. Sometimes like they have contractors. I think that's like something that's happening now is that they're like um getting rid of the contractors and trying to like adjust like how the process works or something. Like maybe all the wokies are getting retired or getting fired, who knows. But like my point is that like, as a hardcore Nintendo fan, someone who's been like seeing this since 2014, like the complaints about Nintendo's localizations specifically make no sense. Right? Like the fact that people hyperfixate on them specifically speaks volumes as to like their bias against the company, right? Like it has nothing to do with woke culture or like anything the company is doing. It has everything to do with the fact that like everybody wants to see Nintendo fail, and people are completely willing to make up things out of whole cloth in order to push their narrative. And we are seeing that quite a bit when it comes to Gamergate 2.